the rules are essentially there are exports to Canada can be processed, and then if there is enough local content, then it will qualify under NAFTA rules to be exported duty-free to the United States, and vice versa. Most of the few of the cases that we have had, actually it's the other way around, goods coming into Canada and then being re-exported to the United States. But re-exporting generally does not happen because goods market are meant for the Canadian market goes to Canada, goods meant for the United States goes to the United States. One of the unfortunate failures we had in negotiating NAFTA was, unlike the European Union, where the Treaty of Rome applies and member countries do not impose anti-dumping duties or countervail duties on each other's exports into their countries. In North America, we did not achieve that. We would have liked to, but we did not. And therefore, we still have cases where, in this particular example, hypothetically, I would say, if the exports are being then Korean goods are being re-exported from the United States into Canada, and it is perceived to be dumping, then anti-dumping laws will apply anyway.
There's another question: should we not consider livelihood books to be included under the WTO? I think this is something which has come up in the context of the agriculture negotiations. So I will leave this to be dealt with by Mr. Goda in the afternoon. But I will say that it's a woolly idea, and it's totally uncalled for, and it's dangerous. But Mr. Goda, I'm sure, is going to deal with this when he talks about agriculture. What is India's position to attract FDI? I don't know. I don't know. I'm not keeping track of what is India's position to attract FDI in tourism. I'm sure that I think there are some other problems in that promoting tourism. But I don't think there are any restrictions on FDI. I don't know. And I'm not, let me tell you, you got to do this. I'm not an expert in all service sectors. There is a freedom to change your regulations, and it is only when you make commitments as additional commitments, which are voluntary kind of things. The additional commitments by their nature are those which are not inconsistent with the provisions of GATS agreement, nor are they barriers to trade. They may be barriers, but they are justified on public policy ground. The issue is that if you make those commitments, and what's happened so far is the commitment has only been to the principles of regulation, not to there is no attempt at harmonization. I don't think harmonization will be possible. All that will happen is what happened on the lines of the reference paper in telecommunications is that regulatory principles will be involved, and the implementation of those principles will then be left to the national governments. There are different. I'll give you an example in the telecommunications. It is recognized in the reference paper on telecommunications that universal service obligation will require to be funded. That a telephone should be available. It depends on how you define. For instance, in India we have defined at the moment universal service obligation access to a telephone within 5 kilometers. But there are jurisdictions where every home should have a telephone. So the costs involved in providing that, there are ways of doing that which are pro-competitive. Rather than give a monopolist the right to earn monopoly profits in one sector and then subsidize that. The other way, which is now evolving internationally, is to ask everyone to contribute to a fund. And that fund is administered by an independent body, and gradually over a period of time, the liabilities in that on that account get reduced.
Well, if there are no more questions, we would like to conclude this session, and it's my pleasant duty on behalf of all of us to thank both our speakers, Mr. Tulshi and Mr. Sadat, for their very, very interesting presentations. Mr. Zulshi, in fact, in his presentation, gave us a lucid, focused, very competent view of the issues that we have to beginning to occupy an ever-increasing share in the size of the nation's economy. But there are a few interesting ideas that he has brought to our attention in this presentation. And but I do not intend to sum up what he has said. I'm deliberately mentioning some of these because I think they require much more reflection and perhaps effort to try and progress further. The first major thought that he brought in was the concept of progressivity of liberalization, which has been brought in the context of the negotiations in the services sector. Then he introduced the concept of cluster approach being used for negotiations, whereby you link various sectors that you want to seek concessions or limitations on, as the case may be, because business in one becomes meaningful only if there is access to the other. He's also talked to us about the need for or introducing regulatory principles themselves into the negotiation process because of the implications for that sector, and of course the tension regarding credibility of our policies and the need to dovetail domestic reforms with the liberalization process, which would be an essential feature if we are to succeed in the future negotiations that we hold in the context of services, where there is indeed a tremendous opportunity waiting for us. But I would like to, in my own observations, mention that services, their delivery by very nature, are decentralized in delivery. The control and command structure may be centralized, but delivery of services to consumers is invariably in a decentralized form. And it is this structural aspect which perhaps we need to work on as academicians as well as policymakers to a large extent, because to my mind it raises 3 or 4 very significant issues that we need to examine very, very carefully in the context of our negotiations. First, I would like to mention that this process of decentralization in delivery gives a unique opportunity of access to hard and soft technologies to the nation, and an opportunity for us to learn and familiarize ourselves with these technologies and progress them further. Second, this process of decentralized delivery gives us a major opportunity for employment generation as we change the quality of lives of our citizens. And thirdly, also an issue which he has brought up and which we need to examine in full context and the implications for our country, which can be used, leveraged to our advantage, is the flow of natural citizens in this context again. And incidentally, we have been able to see repeatedly during the last few years, because of the emergence of certain educational institutions that we have in our country, where we have demonstrated to the world at large about our capabilities in those educational sectors, that we can meet the needs of employment as well as knowledge creation as well as value addition services being rendered through professionals in those or coming out of those institutions. So this is a major opportunity for us, and if we are to make some significant headway in getting advantages for ourselves as a nation, I personally think that this context of decentralized delivery will play a major role and it needs a fair examination. Our second speaker also gave us a very, very interesting narration of not only the context of RTAs and what they can contribute to the competitive and how they can contribute to the competitiveness of the nation, but he also gave us some interesting examples of how Canada has been utilizing these RTAs to their advantage. Perhaps there is a lesson for us to learn too, if we are to follow similar routes or if we are not to follow those routes. Either way, we can learn our lessons and go ahead. The session has been of tremendous learning value, I'm sure, to all of us. It certainly was for me, and I would like to
various items, various issues which the people have discussed. They have told the provisions, but we have, it's left to us to do the analysis. We don't have very many people who bring out categorically the implications, but this is where it is food for thought. And I'm quite sure you will start pouring us with questions in terms of implications on which the research studies can be built upon. We will put them on side so that whoever in the country wants to work on that, he will be able to do so. There are suggestions that research needs to be funded, and if we can know who are the people interested in different topics of research, we can put them in contact with the funding agencies. So in this way, I invite you all to put all the issues, whatever occurs to you in this area for the purpose of research. I also request you to give me just 2 minutes. We used to use the word memento, which we used to be to distinguished speakers, but here we are not doing memento for this purpose. It's like we lit the lamp today morning, same way we are going to give a memento. It looks like memento, but it's more a reminder that this is an opening seminar and many more things will follow. And therefore, I have given to all the delegates, I'm going to do just now, just please be appreciated. All of you will get a memento which reminds you we have made a beginning and the meeting at least 3 times. So give me an opportunity to distribute that. Just a plate like this, where we are like it.
In the afternoon, first afternoon session, I'll take up an explanation of the main WTO provisions on agriculture. And then, time permitting, I will try to explain what implications it has for India over a very short period. Maybe we'll discuss it further tomorrow, but today I will give you what my findings are as to how they impact, the agreement impacts on India. Let me say that the WTO agreement on agriculture was drawn up in the Uruguay round against the background of increasing protectionism in agriculture in the developed countries. While from 1947 onwards, the developed countries had considerably liberalized the industrial sector, they had proceeded in the opposite direction insofar as agriculture was concerned. Every 2-3 years, they used to increase the level of subsidization and the level of border restrictions on their agricultural products. The main industrialized countries, USA, EC, Japan, and the European countries in particular. The developing countries were not the targets of the agreement, but undoubtedly the agreement had to be drawn up in general terms, and it did have some implications for the developing countries like India also. The objective of India in the negotiation was
that the disciplines should not be drawn up in such a way as to impact on the Indian policies. That was the solitary objective of India in agricultural negotiation. And you will be able to see if India succeeded in achieving this objective after I have taken you through the agreement. Next. The agreement is best approached by taking up the 3 pillars of the agreement on agriculture. And these 3 pillars are market access, domestic support, and export competition. Next. Market access deals with the measures applied at the border. Next. It deals with tariffs, it deals with quantitative restrictions and other restrictions that are applied to protect the domestic production. Now, the most important change that was made in the WTO in respect of agriculture was that the agreement on agriculture said that no measure other than tariffs can be used. Now, you will recall in the morning I explained that that was the general rule in any case. But in respect of agriculture, over the years and in the original agreement also, some exceptions had been obtained by various countries during the accessions or by virtue of waivers. Now, everything was to go. Everything other than tariffs were required to go in the agreement on agriculture. All the measures that have been listed there or other similar measures were required to be converted into tariffs. That was the biggest change made in the WTO agreement on agriculture. Next. However, there were certain exemptions from the tariffication requirement. And the 2 biggest exemptions, and these exemptions are important because they were of particular significance to India. Balance of payment measures. You recall in the morning that I said that quantitative restrictions were allowed for balance of payment. That was one of the exceptions. Now, it was an exception here also. Balance of payment measures were exempted. Since India had at that time balance of payment measures in position, India was not required to undertake tariffication commitments. There were some other measures which were exempted, but I will not go into that. Next. Now, once tariffication had taken place, there were certain other requirements. People at that time thought that once the non-tariff measures are tarified, the tariff levels will be sky high and no imports will take place. And that was actually correct, because in some cases, in the developed countries, the tariff equivalent of non-tariff measures worked out to 200 or 300%, or even more. So there was a requirement, unfortunately the slide is showing something else, there was a requirement that there will be a minimum access provided of 3% rising to 5%, and the current access will have to be maintained in excess of the minimum requirement. Now, this was the requirement for those countries which had the tariffication requirement, tariffication obligation. This was not a requirement for countries like India, which were exempted by virtue of balance of payment restriction. I go to the next slide, which deals with the modality. Now, Now the general rule was that once tariffication had taken place, these tariffs had to be reduced by 36% over a period of 6 years. Now the minimum in each product had to be 15%, and the base rate for this purpose was the bound rate, that is the rate bound in earlier negotiations, and for unbound rate it was the rate prevalent on 1st of September 1986 text. Now this was the general rule. The specific rule for developing countries, and this is again important, that the duties had to be reduced not by 36% but by 24%, and the minimum duty reduction had to be 10%, and the period of implementation had to be 10%. The next point on the screen that you see is important. For unbound duties, developing countries were given the flexibility of offering ceiling binding. That is, they were told that you just give any rate and we shall accept it. And the rates given by India, the rates at which India bound their tariffs was, and this is important, 100% for basic products, 150% for processed products, and 300% for certain edible oils. So for products that were already bound earlier in the negotiations in 1947 or whichever earlier negotiations, India was not required to do anything. But for products that were not bound earlier, India was required to give a ceiling binding. And the ceiling binding that India has given, I have narrated it. 100% for unprocessed, 150% for processed, and 300% for certain edible oils. Next. Now this is a slide which I have already covered. There was a disconnect between my presentation and the presentation of the slide. I have mentioned, I'll mention it again, that the Uruguay round modalities of liberalization required that minimum access has to be given by countries which had the tariffication commitments. India did not have the tariffication commitment. India did not have at that time to give, and there is no such requirement in the agreement. This is an important point, and at several places I have gone, including the last presentation I made at IIM Ahmedabad during a seminar of a similar type. There were some people, some professors of that institute who said that there was this minimum access requirement of 3%, which is not borne out by the agreement. Now anyone who says that there is a minimum access requirement, I only invite that person to show me the provision in the agriculture agreement, and there the matter rests. Next, please. Now the next pillar is that of export competition. Export competition includes export subsidies. Next. You will recall that while making a general presentation in the for trade in goods, I had said that export subsidies on manufactured products, or rather export subsidies in general in trade in goods is banned. Now, except for countries like India, which have a per capita income of less than $1,000. In agriculture, they varied this rule. They did not extend the ban to agriculture. Instead, they said that export subsidies shall be reduced. And for that, they first picked up 6 export subsidy practices, which had to be subjected to the reduction commitments. And 3 of these you see listed here. Next. And the other 3 are these subsidies were required to be reduced by the WTO member. Reduced by how much? Is on the next page. Next page. The reduction requirement, the general rule was, shall be 36% in terms of budgetary outlay and 21% in terms of quantities exported. The base period was 1986-1990. Next. Now this was the general rule. For developing countries, the rule was slightly different. For two types of commitments, two types of subsidies, subsidies for marketing exports and subsidies on internal transport of export shipment, there was no reduction commitment to be undertaken. In other words, developing countries were allowed to maintain these subsidies on exports, while the developed countries were required to phase these out according to the formula that I had explained earlier. For the remaining export subsidies, the developing countries also were required to bring down the subsidies at a lower percentage. As you will see here, 25% against 36%, which was the general rule, and 14% in terms of quantities, which was the general rule for quantities. Now this was, next page. This was the explanation I gave for export subsidies. Now the leg that I am describing is called export competition. That had some restrictions also on, some disciplines also on export restrictions. Now there is a very thin level of restriction here, and that you see on the slide before you. If a country has to impose restrictions on exports because of shortages in the country, then there is a notification requirement and there is a consultation requirement. Developing countries are not bound by these requirements unless they are net food exporters. Next, please. I take up next domestic subsidies, which is the third pillar, and which is the pillar that has been the subject next, subject to most criticism in India. At the outset, I will somehow that slide is missing from the presentation, but at the outset I will say that the WTO agreement deals with product-specific subsidies and non-product-specific subsidies. To give examples of that from India, market price support, that is support price announced for say wheat or rice or whichever product, is product-specific. To give an example of non-product specific support, let me give the example of electricity subsidy or agricultural credit subsidy, which are input subsidies which are not product specific. Now, in domestic support also there is a reduction commitment which I have done. But first of all, let me say that certain categories of domestic subsidies were exempted from any reduction commitment, and these categories are listed here. Green, and I will explain each category subsequently. The green box, the blue box, the developing country provisions, and the de minimis provision. Next. Now this is something that I have already explained, that there was this inversion. Next, please. Now I will explain the green box subsidies. This is an important exempt list because it's important for countries, developing countries and countries like India. Now here, what has been done is that all subsidies which were deemed to be having either no distortion on trade or production or minimal distortion, they were put in this box. And this box was totally exempted from all reduction commitments. Now someone spoke about a livelihood box in the morning. Now there is no livelihood box, but what is given here is it's called the green box, and in the green box all the listed measures that are exempted, and these measures are not supposed to be having any distorting effect. The first one is particularly important for India. I have not been able to list out all the measures, but such measures as extension, as research, as pest control, these are all listed under exempt general services. Even the capital cost of infrastructural provisions for agriculture, for irrigation or electricity are exempted from any reduction whatsoever. There are, however, 3 or 4 of these measures which are listed here, which are particularly relevant not for developing countries but for developed countries. You will find here direct payment to producers, decoupled income support and measures like that. Now, why was decoupled income support regarded as minimally distorting? The reason was that minimum support for production is given on the basis of what one produces. Now, if minimum support price is much higher than the international price, then you are stimulating production, because you are promising to the farmer that if you produce this, we will give you this minimum support price. You are distorting. Now there is another way of helping the farmer, and that is to say that, look, we will give up the minimum support price, but we shall compensate the farmer for any loss of income in a particular year. For instance, if a US farmer had an income of US dollars 100,000 in a particular year, and in the next year the minimum support price is abolished, and the US farmer says that it has had a loss of income of, say, of 30,000 because his income has dropped to 70,000, then government would compensate the farmer by 100,000 minus 70,000, which is 30,000. Now this compensation, which is called decoupled income support, is thought to be minimally trade distortive or production distortive because it is given without any need for the farmer to produce anything. So at that time it was thought that it is something that can be made, put in the green box. Next please. Now green box measures are continued here. There are certain structural adjustment provisions and things like that. Next please. I have to illustrate the whole thing by referring to India's situation, therefore I am proceeding quickly. Now the developed countries, particularly the US and the EC, they devised this box also of exempt categories, which was only of relevance to them. They said that where the minimum support price is open-ended, that leads to a lot of distortion. But where it is subject to a production limitation that is less distortive and therefore should also be exempted. So it was exempted in the zero round. Now there is a very big demand that this exemption should go. Next. Besides the green box provisions, there were 2 or 3 special provisions for developing countries, all non-agricultural input subsidies generally available to low-income or resource-poor farmers are exempt. Electricity subsidies, fertilizer subsidies, seed subsidy, irrigation subsidy, agricultural credit subsidy, all that is given to low-income and resource-poor farmers, they are not subject to any commitments whatsoever. The second is investment subsidy. If government in India is to give, and I am told that at some places it is given, some states, investment subsidy by way of purchase of agricultural implements, including tractors, if it is subsidized by 10% or whatever, or giving up the taxes. But it is generally available to all farmers, not farmers only of wheat or rice or tobacco, but all farmers. Then that is not covered by the WTO agreement at all. It is allowed to be done. Then there is a third category which was especially for the developing countries, and that was not so valid for India as for certain other countries like Turkey. Subsidies to encourage diversification from growing illicit and narcotic crops. Next. Now what remains after all these exemptions? Green box, blue box, developing country box. What remains after that is, I think I missed out on one of the things, and that was what is exempted is also, apart from blue box, green box and developing country box, there is also an exemption for what is known as minimum, de minimis, which is 5% for developed countries and 10% for developing countries, separately for product specific and non-product specific support. So I was saying that what remains after all these exemptions of green box, blue box, developing country measures and de minimis support, has to be converted into what is known as the aggregate measurement of support, which is the monetary equivalent of all the support that is there. And you have here described how it is done, what are the elements that go into it. Now, unfortunately, there isn't enough time to go for me to go into great details. Next, please. For product specific, I might as well explain this. For product specific aggregate measurements of support, the calculation is done like this. The applied administrative price, in our case the minimum support price, which is fixed in India every year, minus the fixed external reference price, which had to be fixed at the time of the negotiations, into eligible production. This is the way it is fixed. And let me say what the fixed external reference price is. It was the CRF unit value for the importing country and FOB unit value for exporting country in the year 86 to 88. Next. For non-product specific subsidies, input subsidies, the government budgetary figures had to be taken. If this was not the appropriate way, then the gap between price of subsidized goods or services and the representative market price. For instance, in the case of electricity subsidy, one could take the rate of the rate on which per unit of electricity is supplied to the farmer as compared to the rate at which it is supplied to the industry. Or we can take the rate of production and compare it to the rate of rate at which it is given to the farmers. Next. Now I have still to come to India, but let me say what are the obligations under the WTO agreement. In so far as the market access is concerned, the obligation is that whatever duties you have inscribed in your schedule, you cannot exceed that. For products subject to tarification, there is an option to use special safeguards which enables raising duties automatically. Next please. Also available is the general safeguards which I explained in the morning. For export subsidies, the obligation is that you will not subsidize more than what you have notified, less the commitments that you have undertaken. There is also the commitment that you will not circumvent the export subsidy commitment. Next. You will understand all this when I explain it with reference to India. For domestic support, the requirement is that those who had to reduce, they will not exceed the reduced level of commitment that they have put in the schedule. Next one is important for those who have not undertaken commitments by virtue of the de minimis provision. The requirement is that you will not exceed the de minimis, that 10% for developing countries, separately for product specific and non-product specific subsidies. There is no provision for normal inflation, but if there is excessive inflation, that has to be taken into account. Next. Now, I come to India. Let me first talk about the market access. Now, I have given here the customs, the Uruguay round bound rates and the present applied levels of duty. By present, I mean when this was calculated, we had the 19, the duty which is applicable as of 31st March 31st March 2000. The Uruguay round bound rate is this column. Ignore this column because this is the statutory rate allowed in India, which doesn't have anything. This is the Uruguay round bound rate. And this is the applied level today. Now the difference between Uruguay round bound rate and the applied level, this is of some product I am taking, is the cushion that is available to Government of India to raise duties. You will find that this is indeed a big cushion except in one or two products. You will find, for instance, in the case of broken rice, the cushion that is available is up to 80%, whereas at present the level is 4%. Now, in this column, import policy is shown. The import policy at present is canalized, that is through the State Trading Organization. Now, that has to go by the end of the year, 31st March. So, probably what you will find is that as soon as this has gone and it has become free for import purposes, this will also be raised. That we will see in the budget what happens. But that cushion is there. As far as the WTO is concerned, there is a very big cushion available between the applied levels of duty and the Uruguay round bound rates. Next please. Now I showed you the cushion that is there in respect of certain specific products. Now this diagram shows the cushion in respect of certain chapters of the tariff schedule on the average. Now you will find the applied level in the shaded level and the bound level in the rest of the column, which is not shaded. And you can see that there is a very big gap available almost at every place except under chapter 22. Chapter 22 is is spirits and wines and things like that, where the duties that we have in position are very near the duties which are bound in the WTO. Next. This is the last slide I have, and perhaps this is the most important. I was mentioning, I had explained that as far as domestic subsidies are concerned, we have an obligation that we shall not exceed 10% for product-specific support and 10% for non-product specific support. This is what I had said. Now, in the institute where I am working at present, we have made the calculation of how it looks, what the picture looks like. Now, this column is for the latest year. We have calculated from 87 onwards to year 2000. And if you see this column, this gives you a measure of what our AMS, product specific AMS is, as compared to the commitment that we have that we shall not exceed 10%. You will find that in most cases it is negative. Here it is positive. In the case of sugar cane, in the case of soybean it is positive, and in the case of cotton it is positive in the sense that it is the only place where we are having some sort of implicit subsidization. At all other places where it is negative, it means that we are not subsidizing our production, we are taxing our agriculture. Now, several points have been made on this. So how is it that we are supposed to be taxing when we are not able to export our wheat or rice because the international market prices are higher, are lower? The reason for that, there are some economists who have been saying that we are subsidizing quite a lot, and still, and therefore we have to be careful in future negotiations. Now, I have seen the argumentation of many of these economists, and I have found that each of them has his own definition of subsidy. And he is entitled to have the definition, and maybe that definition is better than the definition given in the WTO. But it is not the definition that matters for the WTO purposes. For the WTO purposes, we take up only that definition which is given in the WTO agreement. WTO agreement has a legal construct. It says this is what it is. There is a certain definition given of aggregate measurement of support. And this is the definition that I have tried to translate here. There, one of the most important things to know is that the comparison is not made with the price that is in existence from day to day in the international market. The price is fixed. It is the price that was notified by the Government of India for the period 1986-88. And that price was notified by us on the basis of the CIF price or the FOB price, as the case might be, that was shown in the DGCINS figures, Indian Director General of Commercial Intelligence and Statistics. Maybe it was wrong, but for the purposes of our commitment, that is set in stone, that cannot be changed, because the external reference price is fixed. Then the other point that is said is that how is it that we say that we are very competitive when we can't export, and at present the prices are quite low as compared to, in one or two cases, the minimum support price is higher than the international price. There have been instances in which the international price was even lower. You see, there you have also to calculate that we may be having higher support price at particular points of time. But that doesn't mean that opening up the doors will immediately result in imports coming in, because there is a built-in freight element of something like $40–50 per ton. So if our price here is $150 a ton, and it is selling at $140 a ton outside, that doesn't mean that we have become incompetitive. Because 140 you will have to add $40 more to see what the effect will be. But that is something different, that has nothing to do with the WTO commitments. What the WTO commitments are, we have translated it here exactly as we had done in the year 1994, when it was negative in most cases, where it was positive, it was less than 10%, which is the maximum allowed, and that continues to be the case. Now let us go to the product non-specific categories. Irrigation subsidy, credit subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, and power subsidy. There again we have made the calculation for the current year, and we have found that it is 7.17%. No doubt it is creeping up. It was only 4.22% at the time we entered into the commitment, the base period for which, and it has become 7.71%. But let me tell you, I have mentioned in the presentation that there is a possibility or there is an exemption for developing country for all product, for all input subsidies given to low income and resource poor farmers. Now all these subsidies are input subsidies. So there is an interpretation that since 80% of our farmers are low income and resource poor, 80% of this should not be taken into consideration. What we have done in the calculation is to err on the side of abundant caution and not take that aspect into account at all. We have not taken into account at all the exemption for input subsidy, just to err on the side of abundant caution, because our subsidies are not targeted only at low income. Even though most farmers are low income and resource poor, our subsidies are given irrespective of what, at least the general subsidy, irrespective of what the category of the farmer is. I think I have finished speaking. Thank you. Go for decoupled income support program, even if sufficient fund is made available, keeping in view the number and size of holdings. I agree with the proposition that it will be very difficult for us to administer this type of program. First of all, you have said even if it is made possible to have these funds, I think it will be very difficult. That is a very big if.
No, sir, even if the funds are made available.
No, first of all, even that will be difficult to make funds available, and even if funds are made available, it will be very difficult to administer. I agree there. The second question was in relation to the explanation I gave in the morning on national treatment of foreign goods. The question is, since we have to give the same treatment under the principle of national treatment to imported goods once they have paid the duties, they have crossed the border, can it ever happen that the the exporters, or rather the importers of imported fertilizer, they say that you give the same subsidy to imported fertilizers as you give to domestic fertilizers. This is the question. Now, the answer to this is in two parts. First, there is a specific exemption, and I had explained this in the morning, to the principle of national treatment. There are two exemptions to national treatment, one for government procurement and the other for subsidies. It cannot happen that by virtue of national treatment, a foreign producer claims that the subsidy that you are giving to domestic produce, you give also to foreign produce. It is specifically exempted in Article 3, paragraph 8 of the GATT. That is the first part. The second part, however, the situation is different. If you have bound the duty, if you have bound the duty, say at 5%, you cannot then go to give a subsidy to the domestic producer without giving the subsidy to the foreign producer, because it will affect the binding. In fact, it has happened like that in a product called diammonium phosphate, which is imported in large quantities in India, and on which the present duty is 5%. Now, at present, the subsidy is being given both on domestic as well as on imported fertilizers. But there is a very big differential in subsidies. More is given to domestic and less is given to the imported fertilizers. And this is being done on a product on which the duty is bound. It was bound in 1979. Now that is also possible, provided the differential today is not more than the differential that existed in 1979 when the item was bound. And an examination of the matter showed that indeed the differential subsidy on imported diammonium phosphate as compared to domestic diammonium phosphate was less today than it was in 1979 when the item was negotiated. So it is. So I hope that answers your question.
Now, there is one more question here. It says that there is erosion in faith upon WTO dispute settlement mechanism because of authoritative intervention.
Yes, there have been some cases in which developing countries have been somewhat dissatisfied with the interpretations that have been made by the WTO appellate body in particular. But that should not immediately lead you to conclude that everything has turned against the developing countries. Let me say that the developing countries have scored some good points, and even India has won a number of disputes against the other countries, particularly the developed countries. So you have to take the rough with the smooth, and where the interpretations are concerned, you have to take an overall view. There is no occasion for you to come to the conclusion that everything is turned against you. Let me say that you have also to take into consideration